proposed ordinance concerning the affordably priced rental units and the Sussex County Rental Unit Program. There's going to be several from the county that will give presentations today. Mr. Whitehouse, Ms. Nauman, and Mr. Vince Robertson, who is the Assistant County Attorney.
Good morning, Mr. President, members of Council. As Mr. Moore pointed out, there will be a team of us presenting this morning. If I can just provide a short overview, and then I'll yield to Mr. Robertson, Ms. Dupont-Palmer, and Ms. Nauman to provide more technical details. As Council may remember, this ordinance was introduced on March 29th of this year. The ordinance was noticed, and the first public hearing before the Planning and Zoning Commission was held on April 28th of this year. Those hearings were held over multiple meetings, with the Commission making a recommendation on June 9th of this year. I can confirm that submitted into the record for this ordinance, we have copies of written comments received from DART. We have a 59-signature petition which is in support of the ordinance, and we have 12 written responses. In addition to that, staff also have a number of technical documents that are included in your paperless packet. They include technical details on the parcel eligibility breakdown that staff undertook with external consultants to analyse the applicability of the ordinance to certain parcels across the county. I don't propose to go through that in detail unless there's questions, and unless there's any questions of me, I will yield to Mr. Robertson.
I do have one question. There was a submission that was on the desk today. Was that one of the submissions that was made that is now part of the record?
That's correct.
From Ms. Drago.
Correct. That number includes that submission there, but it was received after distribution of your supplemental paperless packet yesterday afternoon, so we printed paper copies. So, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whitehouse. So I don't know, Mr. Lawson or Mr. Whitehouse are going to drive the PowerPoint because, as you know, I'm no good at that. So we'll start with a brief overview of the initiative history. As we've explained to you before, this has its origins back in the 2018 Comprehensive Plan. There was a lot of goals, objectives, and strategies that dealt with furthering affordable and workforce housing in Sussex County. And actually, those are also referenced in the whereas clauses of the ordinance that was introduced as well, with cites to those goals, objectives, and strategies. Then in October of 2018, Community Development and Housing developed that RFP that led to the April 2019 contract with LSA Planning, which led to the housing opportunities and market evaluation. That's the cover sheet that you see on the screen there. And the county wanted to do that because we all, I think it's appropriate to say we all realized that there's a need for more affordable housing opportunities in Sussex County. But that opinion only goes so far. We needed the technical background to understand that, what was affordable, what a developer could do, what the thresholds were in terms of the numbers of affordable housing units versus the cost of building the development, so that we didn't create requirements that were not economically feasible. And I'm not going to go through it. You've all seen that housing opportunities market evaluation before. But right inside the front cover is a list of all the stakeholders that participated in that. So there were housing advocates, there were developers, there were engineers, there were certainly county staff. It was a collaborative effort to get to the point where we had actual data that led to the crafting of the ordinance. So, Mr. Whitehouse. So sort of the initiative history, the final recommendations were Strategy 1, preserve the existing supply of affordable housing, and we're pleased to say that that strategy has been implemented. Also, Strategy 2, establish a local housing trust fund. Again, we're pleased to restate again that that's been done. So now we're on Strategy 3, which is this ordinance, modifying the county code to promote housing affordability in growth areas identified in our comp plan. And one of the things, too, just on that sheet, you don't have to go back to it, but that talked about modifying the zoning code. One of the things we realized is that we needed to modify and improve not only the zoning code, but also Chapter 72, which is our existing rental unit program here in Sussex County. So the ordinance was introduced in March 29th of 2022. And I will say there was a question of planning and zoning that came up about the timing of it. And one of the things we wanted to take into account not only was the LSA report, but in that time frame we were dealing with Coastal Tide, which is an existing SCRP development that was breaking ground and actually getting affordable or SCRP units built and leased out. And Brandy's office was working with the folks that ran that community, and I think there were a lot of valuable lessons learned as part of that, what worked, what didn't work, what could be improved through that process, a real-world example. As you know, sometimes when I come up in front of you, I like to talk about how things work in for real life, as my kids used to say, and this was one of those rare opportunities where we had those examples of a real-world opportunity to look at things that worked, things that could be improved, or things that could be streamlined. And I guess, too, that's the one thing that or a significant thing that came out of that lesson with Coastal Tide is what could we do. We knew that we had to adjust, or we could adjust the process, but also what can we do to streamline it from the developer's point of view in terms of operating one of these, and also in terms of our staff. Is there a better way to do this? Because we found that it was a little bit clunky, so we improved that on Chapter 72. So the ordinance was introduced on March 29th of 2022. The Commission held its hearing on April 28th of 2022. And then on June 9th of this year, just a little while ago, the Commission recommended approval of the ordinance with some recommendations. So, getting into the meat of it a little bit, this does create new permitted uses in several of the residential zoning districts. Really, the only one it doesn't is HR, because you can get 12 units an acre already in HR, so there's no point in adding it to HR. But it adds the new permitted uses to AR, MR, and GR. It does, as introduced, permits it by right in the following growth areas of our plan, which is the coastal area, the developing area, and the town center area. As we'll see in a moment, the Commission actually recommended, based on some input we received, to add the commercial area into that grouping. And up to 12 units per acre are permitted if somebody utilizes this program. So, Mr. Whitehouse. This gives you some idea of the locations where this could occur based on our comp plan, those areas I just mentioned. So you'll see outlined in red, just to sort of highlight it, it's the town center, and then there's the developing area and the coastal area. The Commission recommended adding the commercial area, which is the red color. You see that along Route 1 and Route 24 and 113 and 13 primarily. The reason for that is those are all our growth areas, according to our plan. That's where infrastructure exists, water and sewer is either existing or planned. Although state strategies are not a land use tool, it just happens to be that overlay that's where it's mostly levels 1 and 2, where the state also plans to do its own infrastructure investment. So that's the reason why those four were chosen. Mr. Whitehouse. So the design criteria, at least 30% of the units must be set aside as SCRP units. So that means if you get 12 units by right, you have to have at least 4 of every 12 be SCRP units. We had a perimeter buffer requirement, which we'll talk about a little bit more, of 100 feet. We increased the building height. It's currently 42 feet in AR1. What we wanted to do is have it a little higher, but give some design flexibility. That's why it's no greater than 52 feet and 4 stories. One of the lessons we've learned at P&Z, and you might see those sometimes driving around the county, is sometimes under our current height restrictions, people are getting 4 stories in, but it's a flat roof and it has a really, maybe not everybody feels this way, but unattractive design just based on the flat roof design. When we looked at examples that have been built, if you have that flexibility of 52 feet and 4 stories, you can really get the 12 units an acre, but you also get a better looking product at the end. Open space, the ordinance talks about having 50% of the open space or the site remain as open space. We do require central water and central sewer. Frankly, that's a necessity based on 12 units an acre. You couldn't do it with on-site septics with 12 units an acre. The interconnectivity requirement, if the property is adjacent to a commercially zoned property, we wanted to have interconnectivity on that so that people could, with their cars, get into the commercial without having to get onto the roadways. We wanted sidewalks on all streets and interconnectivity with the surrounding sidewalk systems. That's almost similar to what we require or what ends up now in subdivisions and multifamily projects anyways. Walking and biking trails, currently that's required to be interconnected and permitted in the perimeter buffer. There was a tweak that was brought up, I think in the comments, and we'll get to in a moment, that was a requirement that there be walking and biking trails in the buffer. That should be that if you're going to have them, they can be in the buffer. The other one, the number 9, primary view sheds of all units should be directed to open spaces and amenities. That was something in the initial drafting of this that we thought about in terms of making sure that there was a good layout to the development and that people weren't looking out their windows necessarily into the windows of somebody else's unit. I will tell you, on further reflection, our primary goal is to get the SCRP units, and because they're going to be integrated and spread throughout the development, this is one that's less of a concern, frankly, at this point. We'd rather get them and let the developer design it than try to figure out what the primary view shed should be. And then the last one is that it be located near DART routes or planned DART routes. So, Mr. Whitehouse, if you flip it over.
Question.
Sure.
There is no minimum acreage requirement?
No, there's not, and we'll get to it in a moment. We actually, for planning and zoning, did some studies to show, and that was what the information was that Mr. Whitehouse provided in terms of acreage. We looked at sort of the inventory of acreage throughout Sussex County just to make sure that there was acreage available to meet these requirements, and there is. And we actually did a study which is, it's in the PowerPoint, correct? Yes, we had AECOM lay one of these out on 10 acres to make sure that it would work, and you could get your 12 units, you get your stormwater, your buffer, your open space, and your parking. So there is no minimum acreage per se, but at some point, there's design geometry that comes into play.
Right. So theoretically, it probably wouldn't be possible to do it on 1 acre.
No, and the other thing is, by the time you did it on 1 acre with the parking and everything else, it would be tough, and the perimeter buffers. And you need a little bit more units to make it worthwhile, viably economically, if you're doing the 30% SCRP. Just because that number is going to, I think, make it work better if you're, a few more acres than 1. So.
The other question, we are permitting it in the growth zone, in the coastal zone, but can we tighten that requirement down at all to be close to major roads within those zones?
So how we've addressed that primarily is through the DART requirement, because that matches those major roads. Yeah.
Right,
Which
the routes aren't going on back roads.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And we actually have a map coming up in a moment to show where those are.
Right.
So.
Can you go back 2 slides real quick? I have a question.
Sure. Which one, Mr. Shaver, just so I know which one
Right
you're on?
here.
Okay.
So there's really no inventory, and I asked Mr. Whitehouse this yesterday, or this, I forget, this morning or last night. There's very little inventory under this ordinance along the major highway of Route 1. Is that correct?
The coastal, so there is coastal in the southeast end of that corridor, but as you go northwest along the corridor, you can see that that's where the coastal area terminates there at that yellow parcel.
And what I'm trying to point out, there is available inventory to offer this program for development opportunities, what I call out in the middle of the cornfields, but there's nothing really along Route 1, which doesn't make much sense to me, but that's my comment.
So the future land use map is capable of being updated over time, so the ordinance is drafted on the future land use map as it exists today, but that is a correct statement.
I think that's a major problem.
Yeah, no, it's our opinion that the future land use map, that's a living document, so, yeah. So I think I said at least 30% of the units, they must be restricted to tenants that earn 80% of AMI or less. There must be compliance reporting based on submitted audits and certifications. That was one of the changes that we made to Chapter 72 to require the developer to certify to us that they're in compliance with the CPA. And that way we have a third party on behalf of the developer who's saying that, yes, they are in compliance. And that should streamline our office, our staff, in terms of being able to review that information. And, of course, they will do their own audits, too. And then there's financial penalties paid. So if somebody rents one of these units at market rate, there's going to be penalties that come back into our Sussex County Housing Trust Fund for noncompliance. To Mr. Riley's question, these are the current DART routes, and they sort of do follow those major roadways in Sussex County. One of the things that the commission talked about was improving that so that it's more clear that it's not just existing DART routes, but that it incorporates DART routes that may be built, or if you get authority from a written confirmation from DelDOT that there will be a DART route at the time, I think it was half the units are built, then you could go there, so that it was opened up a little more even beyond. Because it's sort of a chicken and egg thing with these DART routes. They may say, no, we don't have it now because there's not the number of people there to use it, but this development would generate the number of people for them to then put that route in. So this is the one, and I'm going to let Mr. Whitehouse sort of explain this. This is a mock-up of a 10-acre site that shows that you can build this project. Again, making sure that we can do this in for real life, we wanted to have an engineer take this ordinance, apply it to a 10-acre piece of ground along 2 county roads and see if it can be done. So.
Correct. And just to provide some additional detail, Mr. President, so we started with an initial concept. We modelled it at 10 acres and we modelled the ordinance at 30 acres as it was introduced to see if it was viable. There was a simpler concept drawing that was shown to the Planning and Zoning Commission at the initial public hearing on April 28th that was more or less the same, but during the hearing process before the Planning and Zoning Commission, we had it fully worked up with full engineered details. The number of buildings is the same, but we wanted to show that if you design parking spaces to code in terms of code requirements on depth and width and spacing and landscaping, not only can the buffer be achieved, but the density can be achieved as well. So this is a 10-acre parcel. It's an irregular shaped polygon, so we gave our consultants, it's not a perfect square, it's irregularly shaped, it's located at the intersection of 2 roads, and it achieves the appropriate setbacks. All the buildings achieve their primary view sheds, which was, as Ms. Robinson said, it's desirable to do that, but that's not the focus of the ordinance. But also, in addition to providing that, landscaping was achievable, buffering was achievable, stormwater management was fully engineered and designed as shown to be achievable. But this concept also has an additional building as well, which is an amenities building for the occupiers, and that's not required in the ordinance necessarily to be provided as part of the design requirements, but we wanted to show that there was room left over on this 10-acre model. We've also modelled it on a larger 30-acre model as well, and it's based on a high-level concept. It was also viable on a larger acreage as well. So,
thank you, Mr.
Is
Whitehouse.
that a question we should take up, the amenities building? Is that?
Well, we decided that wasn't one that we would require as part of the ordinance. I mean, I will tell you sort of anecdotally, we've seen those, whether it's a building or a pool or whatever. I mean, it's some type of amenity. But we also didn't want to make that a requirement because it wasn't really talked about in the LSA report, and that's an increased cost. So if it's a requirement, then we're forcing it, which then would be offset against the SRP units and the income they would generate. To us, that was more something that the developer could run its numbers and see if they could do or not, and make that decision. We just didn't want to mandate it. So. And this one, I'm going to ask Ms. Noman. I went to law school, so I would not have to do math. So I'm going to bring her up to explain this.
Good morning. I didn't plan to have to do math in this job either, but here we are. So to explain the area median income, hopefully in simple terms, as Vince mentioned, we do have a real-world example, coastal tide. So the ordinance proposes exactly what coastal tide adheres to right now. The maximum income that a household can have to be eligible for our SCRP program is that 80% line. So for a 2-person household, the maximum income is $53,800. That could be, a single parent and a child, or it could be 2 wage earners. But it doesn't distinguish which. And then so then the minimum income is there because this is not, there's no federal funding involved in this project. There's no subsidies, and so the tenants are responsible for making their rent payments based on their income. And so there is still a minimum income required in order to afford even our affordable units. So that's where that kind of comes into play. That is adjusted slightly depending on case by case. And then the income rates are actually fixed at 50%. So right in the middle of that eligibility criteria, so that it's affordable for the entire range of households that may come in. So these are the rents that are currently being charged right now at Coastal Tide for our 26 affordable units. For a one-bedroom, it's $660, a two-bedroom is $790, a three-bedroom is $915, and these actually just went up slightly. The income limits came out in April for 2022, and they actually increased slightly for Sussex County, so the rental rates increased as well. Last year, they actually went down. So that is something that, every year these will be fluctuating based on HUD's annual income assessment. So hopefully I answered or described that well enough. Let me know if anybody has any questions.
I have a question.
Okay.
When you figure out how much people can afford a month, that is based on, was like 30%?
Right. So typically, it's 30% of someone's household income
Yes,
that you should spend on housing expenses. So that includes rent, insurance, homeowner, all of that should be less than 30%. We actually kept it at 25% because utilities are not incorporated into the rent of these units. So we wanted to give a little bit of a buffer there for folks to have funding to pay for cable, electric, that sort of thing.
Very good. Thank you.
I don't know if this is the right time to answer this, but somebody proposed to me what would happen in the event that the property owner began to not maintain the property. Do we have any recourse, does the county have any recourse to force them to do the maintenance and keep the property up?
If that's your
Slow turn, Mr. Robinson. Thanks, Mr. Norman. So there's a couple things. Now, keep in mind that, if 30% of the units are SCRP units, 70% are still market rate. So there's going to be the incentive, hopefully, of the developer to keep the entire place going because they're going to want to try to generate as much market rate income as they can. In the event that, the place starts, falling down or, not being kept up, then it goes into building code and constable issues. So I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
Correct. So if for example, primary cooking facilities were not available or broken or damaged, then we have the ability to look into that further. But it goes to whether the units are capable of being occupied. So there's sufficient protection elsewhere outside of this ordinance to look into those issues should they arise.
So the next slide. This one deals with planning and zoning's recommendations from earlier this month. Again, the one was to include the commercial area. That's that fourth area of our comp plan as a list of the appropriate areas for the ordinance. There was the obligation to reduce the open space requirement from 50% to 30%. That one, when we drafted this, I will tell you the staff's thought on that is, one, does it work? And we proved to ourselves that it does work based on the designs. And you saw one design. There was actually a couple others that were done as far as the layout to make sure it would work. And we wanted the greater open space because, and some of these other requirements, a developer is walking away with 12 units an acre in density, in AR1, without a public hearing in front of planning and zoning or in front of county council. It's a site plan that would come in on a Thursday night as other business and would be acted upon that night. So that really streamlines the process, which we wanted to do because we wanted to make sure somebody had a good reason to want to build these SCRP units. But if we're also going to do that, we wanted to make sure, we were sort of getting something in return in terms of good design. And that's why that 50% open space was there. The next one was amend the setback requirements so that if a proposed building does not exceed 42 feet in height, which is the current height limit, then the setback should only be 50 feet, which is the current requirement. If the building exceeds 42, then the greater setback of 100 should apply. The 100 is what's in the ordinance now. I will tell you the background on this one was that we heard some anecdotal information that sort of shed light on this. AR1, if you live in AR1 and you're next to AR1 now in your single-family house, based on our current zoning code and the way it's been in effect for decades, you would have an expectation that it would remain agricultural, or you'd have an expectation that it could be developed at 2 units an acre, single-family homes, residentially, with the 42-foot height limit. And so the reason we had that setback requirement, it went with the height of 52 feet, was so that there would be an appropriate transition between somebody who owns an existing single-family lot and something that's now completely different and not expected at the time that they purchased their property, because they're not going to get the opportunity like they would if they changed it to HR or MR or GR to come into a public hearing and say, well, wait a second, or conditional use. I don't like this application because it's not consistent with my AR1 property, or you should impose conditions on it because of all these AR1 single-family homes around it. So we sort of took that into account, which is why we built in the open space requirements and the setback requirements, so that there was, again, transition between existing single-family homes and the multifamily buildings that could be built by right next door.
Vince, to that point, can I make it?
Sure.
You mentioned that this would be by right with no public hearing, and that's true as the way the ordinance is written, and would only require site plan review. You come in on a Thursday night. Just in case a lot of people are listening, and if it gets in the press, I think it's important to make it clear that this project would still go to Plus, go to DelDOT.
That's right.
Go to the fire marshal, would have complete review by the P&Z department, which would, that review process would probably be 8 to 12 months.
No, that's a fair point, and one that's good to bring up, because, you know, we sort of simplify and say there's no public hearings, and if you know,
there's a lot of review.
Yeah, like Mr. Wheatley would say, if you're not a frequent flyer in this stuff, you might not get the, and I'll just run through that. So in a minute or less. You would come in on a Thursday, get preliminary site plan approval. Again, no public hearing. It's on an agenda. It's listed. And assuming it meets all the technical requirements, and staff's requirements, and it's been through Plus, if it triggers Plus, you'd get preliminary site plan review. Then, to your point, that's not the end of it. You still have to go through DelDOT, Sussex Conservation District, Fire Marshal, you know, like I said, the car wash of agency approvals before you get final. And you would come back again for final site plan approval. Again, neither one of them are a public hearing, so the public wouldn't be able to comment. But there's no short-circuiting of all those agency requirements.
I was going to add, and Transportation Improvement District payments as well. This would not exempt anyone from having to contribute towards an established Transportation Improvement District. So. Right.
And then the last one on there was, and this was just looking at, again, as I mentioned before, those DART requirements, so that it's a little more flexible to allow a development to proceed if DART certifies that we're coming, basically, you know, at the time that it's built. So we had some, I think, some really good comments on these as we went through. And I'm going to go through, just answer some questions that were raised. One of the things, though, I do want to talk about is we don't really we tend to focus on the negative sometimes and not the positive. We did get several comments in support of this initiative from several developers. I heard the gentleman from the Commonwealth Group. They sent a letter into P&Z. We got a letter from John Pardee representing a couple of developers. And I just want to read that into the record because I thought it was really useful. It says, I wanted to make sure that both the Planning and Zoning Commission and the County Council are aware that there is very serious interest on the part of the real estate development community in the passage of a workforce housing ordinance. Indeed, I have a number of clients who would pursue projects for affordably priced housing units if such an ordinance were to be adopted. It says, for this reason, I wholeheartedly encourage Planning and Zoning and County Council to proceed promptly with the enactment of the proposed ordinance regarding affordably priced rental units. And so, you know, that was, you know, a representative, I think, of some of the comments that we got, that there are people who have reviewed this, they think it will work, and they've got folks lined up who are ready to move forward with it if we can adopt it. So there was a concern about the increase from 12.5 to at least 30% of the restricted units that will discourage developer as it reduces profit margins, making projects financially unfeasible. We know that right now it's not been working for a number of reasons. You know, that we've got exactly one development that's done an SCRP project in Sussex County. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think the economics may be a part of it, but I think also is, you know, the uncertainty of going through the public hearing process and how that plays out. I would answer this, too. as far as making a project financially infeasible, that was the reason we had that LSA report. And I had to read it 10 times to make sure I understood it, but with my limited math capabilities. But they went through and talked to developers, and they looked at the cost of constructions and the land cost. And the one thing that sort of struck home with me is they talked about the return on cost and the yield on cost, and then really summed it up with what they called a hurdle rate. What's the minimum percentage a project must achieve to be considered financially viable? And they went through that, figured out what that would be, and that's what our ordinance is based upon. So, I mean, I'm confident that based on the expert opinions, which is based on data and facts, that it is financially feasible. So if you could go ahead.
It's worth saying again that, and I'm very empathetic with comments I've received about the fact that this circumvents the public comment process, because obviously we get a lot of good ideas and comments and ways to improve ordinances through the public comment process, but the trade-off is speed to market and incentivizing a developer to want to undertake this. And time is money. Speed to market is critical in order to make that work. And the uncertainty of making a substantial investment with, an unknown percentage of possibility that it could be turned down, and you're just, that investment is gone, versus 100% certainty that if I check the marks, that we'll be able to proceed. I mean, I can see where talk about hurdles. I mean, that's a major hurdle you have to overcome. So, and this gets back to somewhat of a political question, obviously, but, is the trade-off, the goal is increased affordable housing. How do the public feel about, giving up that right to comment? And so that's, I get it why it's important to make the streamlined process available. But I am empathetic to the comments I've received. I certainly understand it.
Yeah. No, and back to Mr. Schaefer's point, it still has to go through all those agency approvals between preliminary and final, but this will cut off, I don't know what we're at now, 9 months or whatever for a public hearing, just based on the volume, just to get a public hearing. Yeah, well, absolutely. I'm just talking about the time, let alone the uncertainty. That's correct. That's correct.
There was one suggestion I thought was very interesting, in that, it's notable that in the 10, 12 years that the original program has been in place, there was only one project. And clearly that ordinance perhaps should have been revisited much sooner. I'm glad we're tackling it now. But the notion that perhaps, and this was, it's in the letter we received from the Strago, that, if we term this a pilot program and revisited it every year for, say, 5 years, just to, review, make sure that it's doing what we want it to do, and update if necessary, if that's a suggestion that's worth looking into.
Yeah, I mean, that may be one where we do it either informally or it's, it could be baked into the ordinance. The original SCRP ordinance noted that, and actually we have, which will be the next step, there's a housing component which is in our code now, and it talks about, reviewing that. So again, we need to look at, what makes this go and what could improve it along the way.
Right.
Again, looking at real world examples. Yeah.
Well, you have the ability to review ordinances at any time.
Anytime, that's right. That's right.
But if there was like you say, baked in, if there's a trigger mechanism or requirement, it's easy to kind of get distracted with other priorities and not do it. But if it was something that we've committed to make sure we do, it might be beneficial to make sure that it's doing what we want it to do.
Yeah. No, and that's something that we can certainly add in. I imagine it would go into Chapter 72, and off the top of my head, without going and reading the ordinance right here, which nobody wants me to do to find it, but I think we deleted that perhaps, and we would just undelete that and put it back in as far as.
I'm putting it out there for council to just consider.
Yeah. And I certainly think so. You all won't actually see the fruits of the labor here, in terms of the projects coming through, because they would come to planning and zoning. But I don't think it needs to be in the ordinance, but I think it would be a good idea to just quarterly update you, or if one comes through, Mr. Whitehouse advises council, just so that you all know that we've had one and where it is, what the details of it are. The next one, I think I already switched. All right, just go back. Yep. This is what we had talked about before. Did the county perform a formal analysis on whether the SCRP amendments are more likely to result in the greater SCRP development? That was one of the comments we received, and the answer to that's yes. So that was that LSA report. This one was the concerns that the regulatory provisions in the ordinance will increase the cost of building the SCRP projects. I sort of touched on that with that analysis that LSA did on the hurdle rate. Again, they went into the cost of building all these, the cost of all the construction, the land acquisition, and the rents as well. Again, I feel confident that we have data that supports these being feasible. And one thing I think that I had a conversation with somebody that kind of brought it home today in AR1, and we'll just use that as an example. You get 2 units per acre, market rate units now, whether that's 2 single-family homes essentially. With the ordinance, you get 12 units an acre, of which 30% are restricted units. So, if you get to 12, that's 4 units that are with the restricted rents, 8 units with the market rate rents. So essentially what you're getting is 6 more units than you could today at market rate. You get 8 total.
You're doing math.
I know. It took me a while to figure this out in that chart, and I had somebody explain it to me in detail. So, again, if you're at 2 units now, you're getting 6 more units at market rate rents than you could today. So, again, I wouldn't feel confident myself in saying that makes a project economically feasible or financially feasible, but we've got that LSA report that backs it up, and people that are in the business that have sent us comments and say, yes, we think this works.
And that was the goal, was to incentivize the market to react and respond to this market need that isn't currently being addressed.
Right. The next one is concern with the requirement to be located near a DART route. We talked about that. I'm not going to really go through that, but we want to make that perhaps a little bit more flexible than the way the ordinance was. There was a question about why wasn't the UR district included in the residential districts that were listed in the ordinance. And I'll be honest, I had to go back and refresh my memory on what the UR district even was, because it never comes up. And actually, I don't even think it's used, frankly, but it was sort of a district that was established if there were any towns in Sussex County that relied on Sussex County zoning code. I don't think maybe Slaughter Beach, or I'm not even sure we have any in Sussex County that, use the county zoning code as their own, but 50 years ago there were some more that did. So anyway, that's why that's a non-issue, because there's no UR zoning in Sussex County, and you can't do it in the county. It would only apply in the municipalities if they relied on county zoning in the municipalities, which is 0 or close to 0 towns.
Correct.
Yeah. So, there was concern with the residency requirement, and this is one that we have had some real good discussions among staff on. The way Chapter 72 is currently worded, you have to live and reside both in Sussex County to qualify for one of these units. We talked about, and it's reflected in the ordinance, that the Sussex County work requirement should go away, because people may work in Kent County or over across the border and live in Sussex County but work elsewhere. And that wasn't really something that we wanted to create as a limitation in this, because if they're residing in Sussex County, we want to make affordable housing available to them. The other one is that we've had a conversation as well about eliminating the residency requirement. I think what we would propose or consider is that there be preferences for those who live and work in Sussex County, but not make that a requirement. The more we talked about it, and the more Ms. Nellman educated on us, we didn't want there to be even the perception that there's a fair housing issue here with those residency and work requirements. So that's something that we'll look at and probably have a recommendation.
It could be an issue, say, for example, if BV Hospital's recruiting nurses.
Right.
And they're coming from out of the area to relocate they don't live here. Right. So how would they qualify? Right. You know, but yet that's exactly the type of
Right.
individual.
How are you going to police preference?
Well, and that's why we've got to sort of work that out. That's a more recent conversation we've had. And I don't know that we would. You know, it would just be sort of a goal of the language. But
And if we're concerned about fair housing, which is legitimate, maybe it's best just to leave that out.
So that's the internal conversation that we're having. Because I think, as you all agree, whether it's a nurse or a teacher or a police officer, you know, we want the towns or whomever to be able to recruit these people, or school districts or hospitals, and we don't want that to be an obstacle to them getting, you know, these units if they're available. So I tend to agree with, you know, your suggestion that we just eliminate it. But the flip side of it is, and this is the way our conversation's gone, is we want to make sure these units are available to people primarily who are in Sussex County, and not that it becomes I don't know, it incentivizes people just to move here, you know, who aren't going to be living and working in Sussex County, and take up those units that we want to have available for folks that live and work here. The next one was, again, the concern with the residency requirement. This is one that we don't have any issue with eliminating, just because it really has nothing to do with affordable housing. It was sort of a design goal, but if there's concerns about it, that's not one that we're going to, stake our claim on. Because, again, this is a project that is primarily a market rate project. SCRP units are going to be within market rate projects, so there is going to be that incentive to make it an appropriately designed development. If you want to go to the next one. And this was the one that we talked about a bit before, with the regulatory requirements, including setbacks and open space. I mentioned this before, so I'll not go into it in a great deal of detail, but it does create that by right approval with all the streamlines and incentives that are in place. So we wanted to kind of get something back in return, plus keep in mind the impact on, or the new and different initiative that this would create in the AR1 zoning district in particular. And again, I feel comfortable with that because we did go through that design process to make sure that you could get the 12 units an acre with the open space and make it all work. And open space is a design term in our zoning code, so that includes stormwater management, includes other things. So it's a pretty all-inclusive term. It includes all the buffers, everything else. So it's certainly not unachievable. And then this was a concern with the requirement for walking and biking trails in the setback. And I don't know, this one might fall on me. It said that there shall be walking and biking trails in the buffers, in the separation areas. And I agree, that should be may. That if you want to put them in, you can. We're not requiring them to be put in. And this is a concern with the requirement for sidewalks on all streets with interconnectivity. That's currently in the ordinance as it was introduced. And we're certainly open to amendments on this. Again, we don't want to undermine the initiative to provide more housing opportunities. If there would be an amendment, we would like it to include sidewalks in front of all buildings with interconnectivity to certainly the parking areas, but also the walking trails and walkway systems. And again, we're seeing that anyway on multifamily that comes through right now. There was a concern, and this is in our code right now, that if you had a felony conviction, that you wouldn't qualify for one of these SCRP units. And the point was made that there's all sorts of different types of felonies out there, Mr. Hudson can attest to. And some of those, shouldn't, prohibit you from qualifying. So the conclusion that we came to was, and we'll come back if you all are agreeable with some appropriate wording, that basically says, the developer is going to have standards, whether it's credit checks and criminal background checks, as long as the SCRP units are the same as the rest for the market rates, or everybody's treated the same and fairly, that's the way it should go. So, and that is all of my presentation at this point. We'll certainly open it up to any questions you all have, and I imagine there's a bunch of people behind me that want to speak to. So, if anybody
Question to the council? Question to the council? Apparently not. Thank you. You did a good job.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Your math skills were great.
Limited.
It's worth pointing out, too, that this ordinance addresses rental units but it's not necessarily the end of the process.
No.
So the question was raised, what about ownership units? So that's, probably on the agenda, I hope. I mean, I'd love to see that as part of our agenda going forward. I mean, we've talked about discussing tiny houses and things of that nature, and I'm sure there's creative opportunities for affordable home ownership as well. So
There
that's
is.
That's a separate discussion. This is
Right.
we'll deal with today's ordinance today, and then deal with that at the appropriate time.
That's correct. And for the benefit of all of council and the public and whomever, we actually, we talk about Chapter 72. It's actually a two-part chapter of our code. This focuses on the rental portion of that. There is a provision in our code now that deals with home ownership. And as I described to the commission, and we haven't had any that have come through, to be honest, on the home ownership. That's a much more complex project. And I'm not talking about tiny houses. I'm talking about more that, if you build a subdivision, that you have more affordable home owner-occupied units within that subdivision. And the reason for it is you have to be really careful. Let me back up. With a rental project, you have a management company that's overseeing that project and making sure that the units are being rented to folks that qualify for them. With the home ownership, there's not that oversight. You don't have a developer or management company that's making sure that those homes that are affordably set aside are owner-occupied by people who qualify. And the way you have to do that is through extensive certifications by those homeowners, or you have to almost set up a county mortgage program or some way to make sure that there's, I don't want to say liens, but there are liens on the property, because you don't want somebody to purchase one of those and then flip it and just make a profit and sell it themselves on the open market. So that one, you're right, we do need to tackle that, but it's a different set of circumstances.
Did the county have a mortgage program at some point in the past?
Not a mortgage program. We had a down payment assistance program. And we had it's called the Moderately Priced Housing Unit Program, is the section of code that Mr. Robertson's referencing. It's not been advantageous for developers since the bubble burst. The market prices haven't been, just hasn't made sense incentive-wise to pursue. So.
But that is, we haven't ignored it. We've known that's going to be the next step with all this.
It's going to be challenging because the demographics of our area, we're in a little bit of an economic bubble, east of 113 particularly, that is driven by a number of factors, not the least of which is the baby boom retiring wave, where you have people selling homes at high prices, moving to the beach, and certainly able to afford much higher home prices. So that's a bit of an economic anomaly that maybe doesn't exist in other places. It's going to make it a little more challenging, but I do think it needs to be a priority. Mm-hmm. So we look forward to that.
And we do have, I think, good resources for that. We have Sussex County Habitat for Humanity, for example, who does that, so we know their model. They're able to do it through their own mortgage programs or folks that they partner with on mortgage programs, but it is a different. It's entirely different than rental programs, just the nature of it.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Ms. Math.